When people present, like when Diana started, do they speak? Yeah. The campus.
Which is why actually brings the investment.
We could wait for her.
Hey, Lauren and Shirley, it's Maria. We are just waiting for Diana because she hasn't showed up yet. We hope she's just around the corner. Thank you. Hello. Yeah, it's good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session about equitable collaboration and strengthening knowledge about climate change. So this session will explore pathways for equitable collaboration in knowledge production and decision-making, drawing on lessons from the Arctic Council's engagements with Indigenous peoples' organizations. This lesson will highlight the importance of recognizing indigenous knowledge as a distinct and complementary system to scientific knowledge, and the need for structural and knowledge-based equity in climate assessments and policy processes. The aim today is to share an Arctic story that encourages and inspires the IPCC to more fully weave indigenous knowledge into its work. My name is Maria Kvalvåg, and I'm a Deputy Secretary of the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. But first, I would like to thank the IPCC for hosting this pavilion, and in particularly the IPCC Secretariat for helping us organizing this session. But before we dig into more details about the Arctic and different knowledge systems, I would like to welcome Diana Forsats to say a few opening remarks. Diana is the Vice Chair of the IPCC, and we are very happy to have you here to join us in this session. So thank you, Diana, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Maria. And it's really a privilege to be here. And I really would like to welcome in the name of the IPCC your session hosted by the Pavilion. So I just want to start with a short personal story to highlight the importance of working with different knowledge systems. So when I was a child, my grandfather taught me how to deal with heat. Now we understand in this particular pavilion particularly well how challenging it can be. I know it's less pertinent in an Arctic perspective, but I thought that knowledge, what he taught me, you know, how you ventilate at night and how you shut all your doors or your windows during the day and how you shade your windows from the outside. I thought everybody knew it. But so later on, when heat waves started to be much more prevalent in Hungary, then I just posted this because people asked me, wow, you what to do. So I posted it and the post went viral. And suddenly all TV stations were up there and asking me, okay, so what can we do in a heat wave? And it was really puzzling for me that this is just traditional knowledge, how people have been dealing with heat for centuries locally. But we forgot it so quickly that such a simple knowledge would be such, you know, newsworthy. And so that really reminded me of the fact that with the fast transition we are going on in technologies, in globalization, we are forgetting a lot of the really important, or not even including the presently live, but really important knowledge systems that could actually help us cope with, for example, heat, but many other things much better than what we can now. Because, for example, in heat, the IPCC has shown that by the late century, we may have very significant parts of the tropical regions, the heat humidity combinations above levels where it already poses the risk of survival for many people. And what combine that with the research which shows a major cooling gap, that means that without the knowledge of really how to cope with that, so technology alone, we will not be able to solve that because simply people won't have enough air conditioners. So anyway, that's just an example why traditional local knowledge matters, and especially indigenous knowledge. And I'm very proud to say that in this cycle, the 7th assessment cycle, the IPCC puts a very important emphasis on incorporating indigenous knowledge as well as local knowledge. So just quickly, 2 activities that we have very relevant, and I know that one of them will be expanded more on by my colleague, working group 2 Vice Chair Sherry Harper. But the first activity that we had, and I had the privilege of chairing the Scientific Steering Committee for, we had an expert meeting on gender, diversity, equity, and inclusivity. And within that, one of the highlights was to discuss how indigenous scholars and scholars working on indigenous knowledge can be better integrated into the IPCC process, and not only just by ticking the box that we have indigenous scholars, but also how to make sure that they're potentially coming from very different cultures, very different knowledge sharing, very different even conceptualization of scientific excellence, how they can still feel at home, how they can still feel safe and share their knowledge and feel that they can be an equal part of the process. So that has been already a very successful event. We will have the report of the meeting in next spring. But also I'm very pleased to report that during the selection process for the AR7 seventh assessment report, the Gender Action Team, which I'm chairing, we discussed and agreed with the co-chairs that that we gave them some guidelines based on actually Sherry Harper's suggestions on how to incorporate more Indigenous scholars into the author teams, and they have been also trying to implement that as well. So in summary, the IPCC is really putting a very strong emphasis in this cycle to incorporate Indigenous and local knowledge. And also, so you will hear more about our upcoming workshops on knowledge systems, for which I'm also on the Scientific Steering Committee. But the point is that we really welcome this event to dive deeper, and perhaps we will also understand how more we can do in our cycle to incorporate that type of knowledge. And thank you very much for the invitation, and I wish a very successful event.
Thank you so much, Diana, and for sharing your story. So before I move on, I just want to use the chance to say a little bit more about our organization and the structure of Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. If you can show the second slide on the presentation, Jasmine. AMAP is one of 6 working groups of the Arctic Council, and it's mandated to monitor and assess trends and levels of pollution and climate change in the Arctic. In terms of our members, we are more or less structured in the same way as the Arctic Council, which means that our members are the 8 Arctic states: Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the United States, all which have territories within the Arctic. And alongside with the Arctic states, there are 6 organizations representing Arctic indigenous peoples, which have status as permanent participants, also called PPs. And AMAP members also include 38 non-Arctic states and organizations. Our work is directed by the ministers of the Arctic Council and their senior Arctic officials who have requested AMAP to also support international processes that work to reduce global threats from contaminants and climate change. And this includes, among others, UNFCCC, and is one of many reasons that the AMAP Secretariat is represented at COP30 here in Belém. So since its establishment in 1991, AMAP has produced a series of reports and peer-reviewed assessments that detail the status of the Arctic, and the working group has provided knowledge-based advice to the Arctic Council and its member governments and organizations. So with that background, I would like to move to our next speaker. She is online and she is very familiar with AMAP's work. Lauren Devine has been the head of delegation to AMAP, representing one of the 6 permanent participant organization, Aleut International Association, for many years. She is an interdisciplinary scientist, consultant, and advisor. She directed the tribal government of St. Paul Island Ecosystem Conservation Office for 13 years and is currently working on special regional and pan-Arctic projects and food security. She will give a presentation about equitable collaboration based on her experiences working in the Arctic. So Lauren, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I'm joining you today from Denina Lands in Anchorage, Alaska. I want to first note that while I am presenting today, this is collective work. I'd like to acknowledge the AMAP Secretariat, Marianne Falardeau, Vera Hausner, Nathan Kettle, Merit Hetta, Kata Kunert, Eva Kreml, and Gunbritt Redder as collaborators to this presentation. I'm not Indigenous, but I'm here to speak to you today as a representative of an Indigenous organization carrying forward Indigenous priorities and views that I've been asked to convey. I'd like to share my perspectives on what equitable collaboration is and how we can look to strengthen our understanding of the implications of climate change by collaborating equitably. Climate assessments and policies remain inequitable because they're built largely on Western scientific and institutional frameworks that systematically exclude Indigenous and other place-based knowledge systems. So today I want to briefly unpack equitable collaboration broadly and then step through a specific climate assessment process that I'm part of now with the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program in hopes of offering large-scale and global climate assessments like that of the IPCC, some lessons that we are learning currently and some ideas to exchange and iterate on. Achieving just, effective, and sustainable climate outcomes requires both structural and epistemological or knowledge-based equity. Achieving structural equity means addressing the who participates, decides, and benefits from an assessment. To achieve structural equity, we have to address power imbalances where Indigenous peoples lack formal authority in national and international climate policy processes, even when their territories are most effective or critical to mitigation. Tokenistic inclusion in Western processes, and the legal and institutional systems that where governance structures privilege state and corporate actors, marginalizing Indigenous political and territorial sovereignty. Meaning Indigenous peoples must not only have a voice, as they are often offered through consultation or engagement, but also decision-making power. Achieving epistemological or knowledge-based equity means we're addressing the what of what counts as knowledge, what is in or out of an assessment. This kind of inequity undermines the quality, legitimacy, and relevance of climate assessments and policies. We acknowledge and address that climate science and assessment bodies largely privilege academic scientific epistemologies, treating Indigenous knowledge as data rather than a complete, valid system of understanding. Indigenous knowledge systems are richly contextual frameworks that are essential for sustainable climate ethics. These two forms of equity are interdependent. Indigenous knowledge can't be equitably included without transforming structures of governance that controls whose knowledge counts. Structural inequity perpetuates knowledge-based inequity, meaning without Indigenous governance rights, the knowledge systems are continuously extracted or misrepresented. With that broad foundation laid, I want to briefly share with you a project that I'm co-leading called the Societal Implications of Climate Change Assessment, or SICA. SICA resulted from the 2021 AMAP Arctic Climate Change Update Key Trends and Impacts, where societal impacts was one chapter in that update, and it was decided that a full assessment would be quite valuable as a next step. We have 4 assessment co-leads, and 3 of the 6 permanent participants are involved in co-leading chapters of the assessment. The SICA assessment specifically aimed to implement co-production with permanent participants as a defining approach. Attaining co-production in a multilateral assessment is an ambitious and novel endeavor that requires major capacity, funding, and a protracted, flexible timeline. Time and budget constraints were identified early on as limiting factors impacting our capacity to achieve co-production of knowledge. And through extensive dialogue with the permanent participants, we decided to change the original vision from co-production to adapt it to the context and capacities of the time. Not surprisingly, we've encountered some challenges and opportunities for tweaking process towards equitable collaboration. Revisiting the SICA assessment specifically within the 4 to 6 R's of Indigenous engagement, depending on which source you use, I want to highlight some of the adjustments that we've made within our assessment process. First, the AMAP Secretariat, assessment co-leads, and permanent participants have worked to shift enabling and regulatory processes within the assessment, keeping open and transparent communication with the dozens of chapter co-leads and contributing authors. We continue to evaluate the level of representation of Indigenous peoples at all levels of the assessment, despite minimal and very limited capacity. One of the adjustments that we've made in our peer review process is through incorporating a permanent participant expert reviewer to specifically review all text in the assessment with an Indigenous knowledge lens. The permanent participants additionally collectively decided to create a separate space to discuss and come to common understanding regarding topics, issues, and needs within the assessment process. The co-leads meet frequently and are facilitating documenting the process for future efforts. And we encourage and empower all participants to shift the process in good ways, ask questions, challenge assumptions, and broaden their own sphere of knowledge sources that they are accessing to reflect into the process. Of course, I have to mention free, prior, and informed consent as an ongoing process that requires constant attention. Another way to look at this is to revisit our equity slide from earlier. There are mandates and written guidance in place at the Arctic Council and AMAP levels that put bounds on the process. But in the collective desire to achieve co-production and acknowledging the realities of the constraints, participants have worked together in many ways to push the boundaries and soften the rigidity of the climate assessment process while maintaining robustness. We've drafted additional SICA-specific guidelines that further guide roles and responsibilities and are working to implement evaluation and tracking approaches in parallel to the assessment. We provide open and safe spaces and adequate time for collaborative dialogue about sensitive topics. And maybe most importantly, the participants or the permanent participants have put the bounds on what counts as knowledge in this assessment. While this is a bit of an oversimplified example, what we're doing is working to bring our assessment to the middle of differing worldviews regarding climate research. If we can better balance priorities, including inputs about the process with outputs, the deliverables, and look across a wide range of actors to better address whose knowledge is in or out, and address equity in how we view credibility and legitimacy of knowledge within the assessment, then we're going to achieve much broader relevance across groups, but ultimately improve climate processes and research to enable just and sustainable futures. Finally, Indigenous knowledge does not simply exist to support or refute science, supplement science, or be integrated or assimilated into science. Indigenous science is a way of perceiving the world that is holistic, participatory, and in balance with Earth's life support systems. While scientific knowledge is understood as deriving from a systematic enterprise that gathers and condenses knowledge into testable laws and principles, the term science is most often used only in reference to that which has roots in philosophies that favor physical law and reductionism, i.e., Western science. The IPCC is the highest level of academic science regarding climate change, but the process is still somewhat structurally closed to Indigenous participation, reflection, or insights and direct contributions from Indigenous knowledge systems. We believe that the assessment process in general would improve by embracing systematic enterprises of gathering and weaving knowledge systems that stem from other worldviews and ways of knowing and being. And with that, I will say Kagasaku, thank you so much for allowing me to share this space with you today.
Thank you so much, Shirley. That was great. We really learned how you have experience with working together with Indigenous knowledge holders in the SICA process. Are there any questions to Lauren at this point? She will also take part in the panel discussion later. Maybe I can have a question. Just you talked a lot about the process, but could you briefly mention also the scope of the SICA assessment and what kind of systems and sectors you are looking at and what kinds of disciplines the knowledge holders have that you are working together with?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question. We're covering a wide range of topics, everything from economies and livelihoods, Arctic food systems, transportation and infrastructure, disasters, health and well-being, energy systems, and what we're asking our authors to do is not just look at peer-reviewed scientific literature, but also to pull from the already large body of work that has been published and exists in various formats that includes Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems in it. And this is applied to describing and looking at the context for the climate impacts that are already observed, looking forward to future potential impacts based on various scenarios for our climate futures. And then also walking through successful adaptation strategies that have already been implemented and the types of planning processes and approaches and methods for future activities that relate to each of those different topics. And so we have quite a wide range of topics that are being described. And we also take one chapter to set an appropriate contextual framework for the assessment that recognizes the impacts of colonialism, global markets, non-climate drivers of impacts and risks on societies in the Arctic. And then we also have synthesis and integrative chapters that are looking at climate adaptation and mitigation strategies that we can look to as quite a focus around Indigenous-led or nature-based, which often mean Indigenous-rooted solutions to climate change.
Great, thank you so much. So this will be not only the process of this, but also the content of this report is definitely relevant for IPCC when it comes out within a few years. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Shirley Harper. She is a professor at Canada Research Chair in Climate Change and Health in the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta. Her research investigates associations between weather, environment, and health equity in the context of climate change. And she was a lead author to previous IPCC reports and is now currently an IPCC Vice Chair for Working Group 1. And she will share with us some information about the AR7 cycle. Shirley, please.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. It's really great to be here today and to be able to join you online. Hopefully you can see my screen okay. I'm joining today from Treaty 6 territory in Canada. I'm a non-Indigenous person, but really honored to be here today to tell you about some of the things that IPCC is doing in the 7th assessment cycle. But to do that, I'd like to just take one step back and look at what one of the overarching goals of the IPCC is, which on the screen here, you can see that the objective of the IPCC is to provide governments at all levels with scientific information that they can use to develop climate policies. IPCC reports are also key inputs into international negotiations. And if IPCC's job is to sort of like assess the state of science on climate change, then we really believe that this really must include Indigenous knowledge systems as well. So how has this been done up until now? Well, if we go back to the 6th assessment cycle on the special report on the ocean and cryosphere and a changing climate, I think a key finding from that report or a key statement in that report is that either Indigenous knowledge alone or used alongside Western science is really important for climate change. And so the report really emphasized that Indigenous knowledge can stand on its own. It doesn't need to be integrated in with Western sciences or to be validated in that way. And there's a figure that helps illustrate that. So this is a figure from the SROC report. And you can see here where you have different knowledge systems coming together to help provide information on a climate change topic. So this could be, different Indigenous knowledge systems coming together from different peoples, or Indigenous knowledge systems coming together with more Western sciences, and so on. But we also point out that these things can stand on their own. So you can use, for example, Indigenous knowledge systems in and of themselves to make decisions related to climate change. And so I think that some of the key findings reported in this special report was that Indigenous knowledge is critical to understanding climate change, it's critical to responding to climate change, and it's critical to the governance of climate change. Then in the Working Group 2 report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, this line of thinking in the assessment continued and moved forward. But we added an element about how to do this. So to understand, respond, and govern climate change using Indigenous knowledge systems, this has to be done through Indigenous self-determination in the assessment process itself and in each of these different steps. So in that report, there were a few important IPCC firsts. So it was the first time that Indigenous content was included in every single chapter of that report. Primarily authored and penned by contributing authors who were Indigenous themselves. Colonialism was explicitly named in the summary for policymakers, which was a pretty huge deal. And so the conclusion was that colonialism, you have to address colonialism to be able to address the root causes of climate change maladaptation. And so to adapt to climate change effectively, colonialism needs to be taken into consideration. In the summary for policymakers, it was also the first time that Indigenous rights were explicitly named. And in the AR6 cycle was the cycle where the first Indigenous observer organization was admitted to the IPCC. And since then, in AR7, there are now 2 Indigenous observer organizations. So what are some next steps for the 7th assessment cycle? As the Vice Chair Deanna had already pointed out, making sure that there are Indigenous lead authors and coordinating lead authors for AR7 has been a top priority. And in the special report on cities and in each of the working group reports, there are Indigenous lead authors who will lead that assessment. But the thing that we're working on next is exactly what Lauren was outlining in terms of the Seeker project, is how do we do that in an inclusive way? And so to help inform and to figure out how to do that in a good way, one thing that we've already done, which was hosted in September, Deanna was the chair of the scientific steering committee for this expert meeting on gender diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we also have an upcoming workshop in February this year that's looking at how to meaningfully engage with diverse knowledge systems to do this in a good way. So we're sort of at the beginning stage where hopefully we'll be developing the type of framework that Lauren had outlined earlier. Another thing that's maybe more immediate that I just wanted to flag is that the city's special report is currently going through the expert review session right now. And so if you have expertise on Indigenous knowledge systems, we are holding a webinar about how to review how to sign up to be a reviewer for the city's special report. So I guess the main conclusion from my presentation is that Indigenous research matters, Indigenous knowledge systems matter, and it's really key for IPCC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley. Are there any questions to Shirley?
Hi all, I'm Martha from the State Campinas University. I'm really happy to hear your presentation. My question is that I didn't understand if there are already Indigenous authors at this round of the IPCC, or if this is an intention.
Did you hear, Shirley?
Yeah, I can hear very
Yeah.
well. Thank you so much for the question. And yes, there are Indigenous authors who have been nominated by governments and Indigenous, and observer organizations and by the IPCC Bureau. And there have been Indigenous lead authors and coordinating lead authors who have been selected and who will be lead authors on the report. So the answer is it's not just an intention, it's happening. And it has happened.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and it will be really excellent to hear about the results coming from the workshop. Maybe this question is kind of, well, up in the air before you will have the meeting, but Indigenous knowledge is also very place-based. So in bringing it to the process as global as the IPCC is, I was just wondering if you could comment, how do you bring this diversity of Indigenous knowledge from very different places, from very different regions? It's one thing is, I think there are elements to these knowledge systems that they all share, but at the same time, they are very rooted in the place where they originate from. So I'm just wondering what is IPCC's take and approach on this? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a question that I don't have the answer for because it's such an important and foundational question. I think that there are other places we can look to examples like the SICA assessment. We could look at IPBES for examples on how to do that. But I think that there's no perfect solution for that. And maybe part of that is just being aware. And maybe Lauren has suggestions for IPCC on how to do that, or even to share those in the room, of course. At the workshop, for example, one of the things that we had a huge emphasis on was making sure that participants in the upcoming workshop have Indigenous participants from all the different sociocultural regions in the world. But even then, I mean, even within Canada, there's so many different Indigenous groups and different Indigenous knowledge systems, like you said, that represent place-based knowledge, and how to make sure we're not excluding any of those is certainly a challenge.
Thank you for that answer. We can move on to have some people on the stage and continue the discussion. Shirley and Lauren will also join us in this discussion. So if Chief Bill and Rolf Redvan and Diana, if you want to have a sit in the chair. I will go to you first, Chief. Since I know you have a long history of being part of the Arctic Council, you are the chair of the Arctic Athabascan Council, AAC, and representing the AAC as a permanent participant in the Arctic Council at their highest level. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience with the Arctic Council and also explain the specific and unique setup of this organization?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the organizers for bringing us together. This is a very important dialogue. I am Dene. In the books, they call us Athabascans. I'm from Northern Canada, close to Yellowknife. We are members of Treaty 8. Our agreement was with Great Britain. There's two agreements that we have, one in 1899 and one in 1921. They were not with Canada because Canada didn't have the authority to enter into treaties. So our agreements are with the British Crown, the international agreements. And so they recognize our ability to govern ourselves and to work at that governing level. In terms of the Arctic Council, at the beginning of the presentation, you saw the graphic, and it showed that there are 8 Arctic states and 6 permanent participants or Indigenous peoples organizations. We are one of the Indigenous peoples organizations. When they were talking of setting up the Arctic Council in the late 80s, they approached us on setting up this idea of having a body that would discuss Northern issues, whether it's economic, social, environmental. All of these issues need to be dealt with in common. And they wanted us to be involved. So as Indigenous peoples, we talked about it. And what we said was, if we're going to be at the table, it can't be the structure, for example, that the United Nations has. The United Nations only recognizes us as observers, and they called us non-governmental organizations, which is very insulting because we all govern ourselves and we are nations. We meet the international criteria of nations because we have languages, we have land, we have culture, we have values, we have economies, we have laws, etc. So what we suggested was that if we're going to be at the table with the 8 Arctic states, we all have to have the equal authority. They came back to us and said, we can't quite set it up that way, so let's talk more. So we did. And we came back with the way that we make decisions, which is by consensus. So we said, we will work with this, we will work with you if you agree to work with us based on consensus. And so the states came back and agreed to do that. So the whole concept now, after more than 25 years, is that we work on consensus. And it was very interesting because that's the way we govern ourselves. Consensus means we talk about something, we think about it, we work at it till we all agree. And then we don't change our mind. that's how we focus. The countries, especially the US, for example, when we first began, they took consensus to mean that it's a veto. So whenever we brought something to the table they didn't like, they'd say, sorry, we can't agree on that. Let's move on to the next subject. And it was very interesting to watch because the first few years, that was the tactic that they used, but they found out that they couldn't get anyone's support. So we really didn't make a lot of progress. But what has happened over the years is the organization called the Arctic Council, with its working groups, with its observers, with its different mechanisms, has matured to a position now where we can actually get things done. And we've heard the presenters say that Indigenous knowledge is a big part of that. And that happened because we demonstrated that the knowledge that we have is equivalent to what you call science, scientific knowledge. It's very scientific, the stuff that I learned from my father. So I want to say that as opening comments, and I want to say that we're much more advanced than the United Nations. The United Nations is really an old body that has never really worked. Not that it doesn't do anything, but it's not constructive and it's not inclusive. And we're not perfect, but we have developed a way to focus on northern issues and have the urgency to get things done. Just one final comment on the issue is, right now there is a pause. There's an official pause because Russia is a formal part of the Arctic Council, and because of the war in the Ukraine, we can't have everyone's full involvement. So there is a pause, but we have a whole mechanism in place that still makes work possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief Bill. I will move on to Rolf Rødven. He is the Executive Secretary of Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. And I would also like to hear a bit about you, what this setup looks like in practice, because AMAP is one of the working group that is implementing this collaboration with Indigenous knowledge holders.
Thank you, Maria. And I think what you mentioned there is kind of core, and me and Chief Bill were talking about this earlier. Like, it all comes into implementations. Like, how do you condense your ideas, your aspirational targets, your political strategies, and so on, into practical work? And when it comes to science, it is about do collaborative work, but also about how do we peer review that literature? How do we also, as was mentioned here by from the audience, like, how do we ensure that we kind of grasp not only the local knowledge, but how can we expand that globally or to a wider area, also when it comes to Indigenous knowledge? And it's not about, I mean, this is something that's not easy to solve. We spent 35 years trying to move forward. There was a major milestone 20 years ago with the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, where it was actually the really first assessment where we brought forward both Indigenous knowledge as well as Western science. And also, one of the times we really realized how much added value that brings into our understanding. But it is not easy. We do it bit by bit. And as Lauren also explained, it's also about one way of moving forward is to, instead of just discussing on the abstract level, to do it like do one step, start with the practical things, start by doing our projects, and then to extract the knowledge we have. So when we do the SIG assessment, as she mentioned, we do try to find our own guidelines, but it's not only guidelines for the SIG assessment, but it will be guidelines for our collaborative work or co-production with Indigenous peoples in general. So, and by doing bit by bit, we sometimes succeed. We sometimes do mistakes, but what is very important for us to have as a joint understanding is that we do not fail until we stop trying. So it's having to be in a position where we have the trust saying like, okay, that was not the right way of doing it, but it was not intentional. And the other party say like, well, we understand, let's try again. As long as you have that kind of understanding, that kind of trust, you do not fail. So it's also about trust.
Thank you. I have a question that goes to all five of you, and whoever feels free to answer. It's about the barriers, the structural barriers, but also opportunities for Indigenous knowledge also to participate in global climate assessments. What are they? What have we been facing in AMAP, for instance, that could be useful for IPCC to also take into account now that in their next cycle? Anyone want to answer? I don't actually see Shirley and Lauren, but if they can raise their hand and then Jespen can let me know. Anyone? Chief, you can start.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if this is a barrier, but I was thinking a little bit about this today. I think one of the difficulties within the Arctic Council is that we may work together in a working group. We may work together at the ministerial level or the senior Arctic official levels and the heads of delegations of the Indigenous people organizations and so on. And we can agree when we're at the table. But then when we leave, we have to implement. And that's the difficult part. Because, for example, if Norway agrees, they then have to go back to their ministries and convince the ministries how to implement. And so I think those practices take time, and that's what we have to work at. And I think we need to focus on that, because especially if we're talking about the environment, as we all know, things are changing so quickly, we can't take forever to implement decisions that we make. So I think that's one of the areas. I don't see this as a barrier, but it's a problem that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
I guess can follow up on that one, and it comes to capacity and the need of capacity building, but also about fatigue. Like there's a lot of research going on, there's a lot of projects going on, and if you draw on the same indigenous knowledge all the time, it takes a lot of the time. And we have to remember that when you take a researcher and ask a researcher, would you like to contribute to an AMAP report? You take that researcher away from research, from his other research or her other research, but still what she does for us will still contribute to her academic record and so on. And so it's kind of a synergistic thing. If you take a reindeer herder or an Inuit seal hunter from their seal hunting or reindeer herding to do research, you take away their income and you take away the time which they share with their family and which you share with the reindeer herd and which is a part of the system they live in. So you have to compensate for that in a good way, and that's important for us to remember that it's not just a resource we can draw upon without giving anything back. We both need to give something back in terms of knowledge or in terms of a collaborative product, but also in terms of other resources. So one of the things was successful was in one of our co-produced projects. It was called CITE, Climate Impacts on Terrestrial Environments. Which is very similar to the Sami word SIDA, which is a reindeer herding unit. And that was about reindeer herders and how they're affected by climate change and how they can operate about it. But basically, when we applied first time for the funding, we had no idea about how to do this. So we applied for planning, for the planning process. So we applied to the Nordic Council of Ministers, basically more or less saying, we are not sure what we're going to do, but it's sure going to be great. And they gave us some money on that, which allowed us to sit down together and design the process together, and design the project and build up that trust, and also give something back to reindeer herders. And that kind of luxury you really find. But that's very important for us to remember that the funding mechanisms we have do not always fit this kind of knowledge product.
I think I'll go to Lauren first and then to Diana. Lauren, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I will echo one of the challenges is the mismatch that Chief Bill spoke to, and the urgency of the problem and the time required for these large systemic changes that facilitate co-production of knowledge in its truest sense. And the barrier in and of itself is that this is difficult and complex work to do. It requires many, it is very time consuming, and it is hard and draining work that puts a high burden on Indigenous peoples and Indigenous organizations, but on everyone that's collectively coming into the work. The challenge will continue to be funding and capacity, but I think it's important to acknowledge that just the ability for us to have this conversation, we are seeing this acceptance that Indigenous knowledge is valid, is complete systems, is incredibly valuable in global assessments. It does not scale neatly, and that's a strength. And so now we're in the next step of this long process, while we're also kind of all aware of this global planetary crisis and the urgency of that. And so I do like the way that everyone has framed it, and I bet Shirley has some amazing insights as well. But I just want to kind of acknowledge that it's quite encouraging, and just echo Rolf that sometimes we succeed and sometimes we make mistakes, but the only failure is when we stop trying. And so I really think that that's an important way to frame this.
Thank you, Diana, and then Shirley.
Thank you very much. So I just want to add a couple of points because already some really excellent points have been made. So first, I want to reiterate the issue of resources. So for example, what we have been facing is when we are inviting Indigenous scholars that from the Global South, they are eligible for trust fund support. From the Global North, if they are from there, they are not eligible for that. And sometimes it's institutions who usually cover the cost of Global North experts, but many Indigenous scholars may not have, representatives of Indigenous communities may not have the kind of resources that perhaps well-resourced Western research institutions have. So that's we've been facing that earlier, but fortunately, many of the governments in these countries very much support their Indigenous scholars as well. So, but perhaps I will throw back the question a little bit to Lauren, because I did have my hand up, but maybe it's better to ask the questions from her here, because that was really such an enlightening presentation, but it was also a bit intimidating from the perspective that it puts the bar very high for us as IPCC, even though you didn't say to us, but because it's not so easy for us to immediately go for not trying to integrate Indigenous knowledge into Western knowledge, not or even complement. You said even complementing is not right, which is, I think we all fully accept that. Still, we have a fairly rigid system which has been elaborated and worked on and not perfected, but certainly institutionalized for decades. And it's very difficult for us to change. So I guess the question to you is then how do you, so that's, I think it's a barrier, certainly. But what would be the best practices, for Rolf and you from SICA, that you could share with us, which perhaps we could uptake in terms of how to avoid tokenistic inclusion, how to avoid just complementing science or integrating Indigenous knowledge into Western knowledge. And we will have the experts workshop, but I think it would also be really useful for us to be able to have some of your experiences documented and share with the participants. We usually collect documents that the participants can use. So if there is anything that you can share with us, which IPCC can learn from, how to better overcome these barriers that we are now discussing from your best practice, that would be very, very welcome. And finally, I just apologize that I will have to leave in a few minutes, but it's a really very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. I'll let Lauren answer first, maybe since it was directly to you.
Yes, well, I'll try to be brief because I'm eager to hear what Shirley wants to share as well. And I acknowledge it can be intimidating, and I want to also recognize and kind of make sure that we are approaching this from a positive standpoint and out of open-mindedness and this spirit of coming together to work on these with the full reality that we are trying to implement changes that are very difficult in the systems that we've built. And restructuring systems and institutions is multi-generational work. Indigenous peoples have endured for millennia. It is not something that is discussed as seeing these changes can happen tomorrow. They are going to take time. I think that the advancement that IPCC could make and has made, like, let's just acknowledge that. I think it's very encouraging for us to recognize where we are working and trying. The messaging that is coming from leadership, from working group chairs, from lead authors and coordinating authors really should continue to press for pushing the boundaries just a bit. Let's widen our thinking and be open-minded and acknowledge that we have a lot of barriers and that change is very difficult, and we can make these very incremental tiny steps forward, and that is amazing in and of itself. Each effort that we do, what I have appreciated from SICA assessment and of AMAP as a working group of the Arctic Council is that we are coming together and agreeing to disagree, but digging deep together and having those spaces. I'm very hopeful that these workshops will reflect open, safe spaces to bring people together and not use non-consensus as a veto, for instance, right? Not silencing voices, not using dissent to pass through topics, but we really do have to dig into this work together. And so I'm very happy to share SICA documents and any guidance that we can give you. That's a different conversation we can talk about later. But just for IPC generally, I think it's important to just continue bringing people into the process and empowering those that are already in this process and have the experience of the decades of being in the process at various levels and all levels to start messaging strongly where we want to go, the aspirations that we have, and then just keep working together, keep an open mind, and keep making this process just a little bit more inclusive every step of the way.
Great answer, Lauren. I'll give the word to Shirley first and then Chief Bill.
Okay, I'll try to keep it quick because actually a lot of the ideas that I had have been shared and I totally agree with them. I think as Deanna shared, IPCC, one of the challenges that there's a lot of internal momentum within the IPCC, a lot of institutional momentum, and that momentum can be hard to break to bring something new and innovative in, something important as Indigenous knowledge systems in a meaningful way. However, I have to say that governments are increasingly, the government panel is increasingly asking for this. There are Indigenous observer organizations, and I do take note of problematizing the word observer, but they've been holding us accountable. They raise interventions and they hold us accountable to moving this forward. And I think that there has been this encouragement for IPCC to catch up in terms of including Indigenous knowledge systems in a meaningful way. And I have to say that I feel like there's this unique window of opportunity right now in AR7 for us to not just catch up, but for us to actually contribute to the advancement of this idea and to do a better job. So instead of just focusing on catching up, to actually maybe leapfrog past some of those, lessons learned from other organizations so that we can do even better. And I do feel like there is an opportunity for us to do that this cycle.
Thank you, Chief. And then afterwards, there can be some questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you. It was mentioned raising the bar and having a high standard. One of the other things that we're doing at the Arctic Council is every 2 years, the chairmanship or chairship changes. And when Iceland had the chair last, at the end of each chairship, there's a declaration that's drafted. And we were able to have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, what we call UNDRIP, endorsed in the Arctic Council. It was also included in the 10-year strategic plan. And the Arctic Athabascan Council, the AAC, along with Canada, have agreed to co-chair and lead this initiative so that within the Arctic Council, there's a whole push to have UNDRIP implemented. So, for example, you have a working group, you have PAME, the EPPR, for example, which is emergency management and so on, has really taken this on, and they're using this within their working group. So it's one of the things that we're working on. It's a whole educational process, but it's something that's really necessary, especially in the Arctic. So I wanted to include that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you so much. A question here.
Hi, well, thank you for those wonderful presentations. So my name is Renzo Tadei, and I'm a new lead author in RA7. So I'm learning about how the whole thing works, and I'm an anthropologist, right? So my question is about how indigenous knowledge is taken inside of this process, particularly in the elements in which there's no clear and easy translation into something that could be recognized in the science side, right? So one of the things, like we had this big manifestation early this morning here with indigenous people say we're not being listened to, and it's not unusual to hear indigenous leaders evaluating IPCC reports and saying we have not been listened to, right? So my question is, when consensus is mentioned, it seems to me that it is consensus about what needs to be done in practice. But is it also consensus about what is nature, what is the world, and how it works? It seems that there's very strong differences and the reason I'm asking this question is that in the outline of the AR7, there are many mentions to the integration of indigenous knowledge in working group 1, the science base, and Charlie Harper is one of the vice chairs of working group 1. So I can see very pragmatic agreements on working group 2 about, no, we don't have to agree on what's the world and how it works in order to construct adaptation plans together. But when we're talking about the description of reality, which is supposedly what working group 1 does. So my question is, how is it going to be done? What are the plans? And whether instead of having incremental advances, wouldn't it be more interesting to do something like what COP does with like phasing out fossil fuels and having the ambitious target and then planning the road to where we want to get, right? So what it means having the difficult conversation early on in the process and then understanding how is it going to be worked. So I'm learning, but really wanted to hear you about all this.
Yeah, Rolf.
I guess I can start from the Arctic monitoring assessment side. We have the work we're doing are funded in our strategic framework, and our strategic framework has some guiding principles. And one of them is inclusion of indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. Another one is value of diverse perspectives. And that doesn't only go for indigenous knowledge and Western science, but it also goes within disciplines. Like, for instance, we are working a lot with weather connections, like high Arctic, low latitude weather connections. There are quite profound disagreements among the disciplines there on the causality and so on. So this is not new, just when it comes to different knowledge systems, but also, this is not only about different knowledge systems, but also within science. As we are doing assessments, we are expected to give a good overview also on the disagreements then, and also argue for the sides, and also try to bring forward what do we need to know to come with new evidence which can tell us what is the right thing here. And I think that is that is something we can build upon here. And that's, it also follows the consensus principle. It's not about agreeing about one truth, but it's agreeing that there may be certain sides to this topics, and sometimes it's depending on the context. And then also what you said, it is both about incremental steps on the practical terms, but ambitions are long term, and really, I mean, our aspiration targets are we are putting the bar high, as Diana just said, and I think that's we need to have that combination.
Yeah, we have another question from the audience.
Yeah, thank you very much for this conversation. I am a lead author of the special report of cities in the chapter 3. And well, I am working exactly in knowledge in that section, but it didn't make it to the executive summary. That's another story. But the point is that in the report, we are working with local knowledge, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, practitioner knowledge, and scientific knowledge. So we have identified 5 types of knowledge. Still, it's like a Frankenstein, pieces and pieces by this and that, because we didn't manage. Still, it's a first order draft. It's the first draft. But it's a very good attempt to include these different types of knowledge. And also the word colonial or decolonial is there. Don't worry, it's there. Because, I mean, we are trying to do so. So I would like to follow in the idea of how are we going to include then this knowledge in the actions and solutions? Because so far, we need the papers, peer review papers, you know, the gray literature, where is it? So we can include it. And the experience from the communities that are solving and dealing with the solutions, and they are doing so, should be included. So chapter 5 has called for a digital case studies, something. And until 22nd of November, we have the deadline to present just the ideas on how to deal with the solutions. So how the local knowledge, the traditional knowledge, the indigenous knowledge, the practitioner knowledge, and the scientific knowledge, it's solving the climate crisis on the cities. So this is a very good opportunity to showcase what is being done. Of course, I mean, it's also a very difficult situation for indigenous communities that only speak Quechua, Aymara, and they don't speak English. That's our tax. I am from South America. So that's another piece of work again. But still, I think you have the opportunity there to contact with any lead author to present those ideas, because until 22nd is just the idea. This is the solution we are dealing with. And I would love to get, or if you know any other lead author to propose these options.
Yeah, if I could comment, it's Chief Bill. I don't know about all of the knowledge entities that you mentioned. I know somewhat about indigenous knowledge. For example, I mentioned I'm from Yellowknife, and we don't have a big population in the territory that I live in. There's maybe under 50,000 people. There's roughly 35 to 40 communities. And the biggest center is Yellowknife with 20,000 people. In 2023, the wildfires really devastated that part of the country. And almost 80% of the population had to evacuate, go to some northern communities or south. Some went as far as 2,500 kilometers away. They either had to drive through there was only one highway with fire on both sides, or to fly out. And so we say, well, why is this happening? And we know it's partly because our traditional knowledge was outlawed. We were prevented from living our lifestyle that we always lived, which included what they call traditional burning, where in the springtime, in March, for example, when there's still some snow on the ground, I've seen my father do this. We burn the underbrush. We burn the grass and the willows, so that you don't have the old foliage. And what that does is it prevents fires from coming through, or if a fire comes, it'll stop because it can't go any further. So that practice was outlawed across North America. And now you're having problems in California. The season now is 12 months a year. Fire season is 12 months a year. Our season used to be very short, and now starts in April. And there were some fires just starting last month. So very unusual, extremities. So we need to include those practices. I know that's what you're saying, but I just bring that up as an example. Thank you. I know this lady's been wanting to question.
Give her the microphone.
Thank you. I know that you mentioned that in February you're going to have a workshop regarding this theme. And I was wondering, because some of you mentioned that capacity building is one of the avenues that you're taking to really include indigenous peoples, authors, coordinators, etc., in the IPCC process. But I was wondering if maybe this workshop, or if in another opportunity, the IPCC is willing to have a capacity building for their own process, to really include and not expect to do the capacity building to indigenous people. I'm not sure if I was clear. I think that every time that we think about capacity building is like one way. And what I'm trying to ask if you're thinking about having both way, and maybe, and I will finish, maybe considering that here we have the Indigenous Caucus happening, it will be a great opportunity to have a direct dialogue with Indigenous leaders that could help in this process.
Thank you so much for that question. I think it relates a little bit on how IPCC will have a program of that workshop. If you want to say something about that, Shirley.
Yeah, sure. I think, I think that's a great idea to find opportunities, like even, like at COPs to have these dialogues with the Indigenous Caucus, for example. I think that's a great idea. I think there's also other examples of that, like sort of like multi-way capacity building that you spoke of, that other organizations have been trying to do, like IPBES, so we might be able to learn some lessons there. And I'm sure that at the workshop in February, this idea and the highlighting the importance of capacity building will come up. And the one workshop is not going to solve things. Obviously, it has to be like the start of a conversation. And I think that, like, if the meeting or if the workshop is successful, that's what it will do. It will spark many more activities and initiatives, and give us ideas on how to move forward in a good way. So I guess my answer is, yeah, I really hope that those types of recommendations will come out of the workshop, and that we'll be able to action those in meaningful ways.
Thank you for that. We have room for one more question before we end, if there's anyone. Can we try and be concrete with having one or two recommendations from the panelists on what we can recommend would be a good thing to do forward based on the experience from the Arctic Council? You want to go first?
Well, I'm biased because, as some of you know, I'm the executive of the Arctic Monitor Assessment Program, and I'm a researcher, but I'm also a Sami. So I'm one of those indigenous peoples with so I have 1 foot in each camp. So for me, it's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer that we need, in the situation we are, in the crisis we are looking, we're not looking into the crisis, we are in it. I mean, where I grew up, the landscape of my childhood has disappeared. It's not the landscape I see when I go back home. So we are in it, and it's an absolute no-brainer that to be able to address those challenges we already have, and that is about to come, we cannot talk about one knowledge system versus another one, but we have to gain the best out of every knowledge system to move forward.
Chief, do you have a concrete recommendation? Give.
Well, I think I've gone to many COPs, and I remember when, I can't remember the first COP I went to, or I don't know how many I went to, but more than 10. I was at Paris Agreement. I was at COP when President Obama first got in, and there was such high expectations. People were so happy because the US was denying that there was an environmental problem, denying climate change. So President Obama's there, and there were so many young people that were there expecting there to be an agreement. But President Obama wasn't able to turn it around. And so many young people were disappointed. I saw people in the audience crying, tears in their eyes. And so you think, if you're a young person today, what kind of future do you have ahead of you? I used to be afraid when I was pretty young, because in Canada, we're in between the United States and Russia. And I used to think one of them is going to press the button and we're gone. So we're starting to live in fear. But then I realized at a pretty young age that you can't live in fear. You have to do something about it. And so I feel bad for these young people. We can't be arguing amongst ourselves. We don't all think alike. I come from a collective of people. We own the land collectively. We're organized by families. We're organized as part of a nation. The other people in Canada don't think that way, because they think the Constitution says they're individuals. They have individual rights. So we're at two opposites. So how do we come together? We got to come together. And for the sake of the future of the collective children and the future of the individualistic children. So, you know, that's a human need, and that's something we have within us. But we have to, that means the only way you can do that is if you respect the other person or the other people. Thank you.
Lauren, do you want to have like a concrete recommendation, like summing up a bit of the things that we've discussed?
Yes, I think very concrete. I would also be a little bit biased and say that those within the AMAP working group are ready to meet and brainstorm and iterate on these ideas throughout the rest of the AR7 process. I think we can concretely acknowledge that the rigidity of the IPCC AR7 process is our current reality, and not let that be an excuse. If we are struggling with the question of how do we do this, let's try something, find ways, find the places to open the process and bring people in that don't have a route in right now. I'll use myself as an example. I have very limited ways to engage in the IPCC process in any form or fashion. And so I think there's plenty that we can do now concretely, and it starts with very small steps. relationships and people to people. I think that is really where we can get at some of these concrete steps, you know, right now in the coming months.
Thank you. I will not ask Shirley to recommend something to herself, but do you want to say something in the end before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, like well noted on all of the recommendations for IPCC, and I would say just generally for anyone in the room, if they have recommendations or ideas or resources, especially, and all of the panelists too, like to reach out to any bureau member and like I know that we're very eager to draw these and pull these things in. And I guess the thing that I will share is that I feel that Arctic Indigenous peoples played a really important leadership role in AR6 in terms of like getting us to where we are. And I called it, I feel like we're in this window of opportunity right now in AR7. And I feel like that window was opened by Arctic Indigenous peoples in a lot of ways. So for example, the first Indigenous observer organization was Inuit Circumpolar Council, and they have been absolutely instrumental in pushing things forward in IPCC and holding us accountable. There's also some great Sami examples and case studies or case stories in AR6 based on, that were written by some Sami contributing authors, for example. And I know that there will be Arctic Indigenous peoples who are participating in the workshop that we have coming forward. So I guess what I'd like to say is that I think that IPCC has already learned a lot from Arctic Indigenous leadership, and that I know we're looking forward to continuing that journey in AR7.
Thank you so much. So I think we will sum up and conclude. It's been a very rich discussion. It's hard to sum up all the things we've had, but I feel like I hope it's been a helpful discussion, both for us in the Arctic Council and in AMAP, but also for the IPCC and the listeners in the room. And I'm looking forward to continue this conversation, but I also think that we just have to walk the talk. So by that, I'll thank you all for joining. Thank you.